Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. Um, Thanks for joining us in what I hope will be a useful and inspiring discussion on bushfire recovery. I'm Phoenix Wolf, Area Manager of the Southwest team at Trust for Nature, and my role at Trust for Nature is to oversee our work with landholders in the southwest of Victoria, which includes Wimmera, Little Desert, Garryword, Grampians that have been impacted by the fires in the past couple of years. I'm really excited to be gathering online with members of the Trust for Nature community, including landholders with conservation covenants and land for wildlife properties. With that in mind, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, sea and sky we call Victoria. I'm joining you today from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Since time immemorial, First Peoples have managed the land in ways that enabled people and nature to thrive. I want to acknowledge the ongoing care of First Peoples for their country, including using cultural fire to heal country. If you'd like to join, if you'd like to acknowledge the country you're joining from today, please add it into the chat. Tonight, we are also discussing how the land recovers from bushfire and what we as land managers can do to help. Over the past 6 or so years, major fires have impacted habitat on private land in Victoria. These include the most recent fires in January this year, the fires in Garryword and Little Desert in the 2024-25 summer, and the Black Summer fires in 2019 and 20. Fire can be a heavy topic for many of us, but I hope that by coming together and sharing experiences, we can learn from each other and perhaps lighten that weight a little bit. For the first half an hour, we'll hear in turn from landholders impacted by each of these fires, and they will share a little bit about their experiences of the fire and the recovery after it. And after that, we'll move on to a Q&A for about 20 minutes. So if you've got any questions for the panelists or Trust for Nature team members, please pop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you can't see it, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, click those 3 little dots that say more, and you should be able to see it there. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to rewatch later. So if you're having any technical difficulties with the webinar, please reach out to the Trust for Nature team through the chat function. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lawrence Berry, the Senior Manager of Conservation Science at Trust for Nature, who's going to set the scene for us and explain some of the big changes we are seeing in the way bushfires impact habitat. Welcome, Lawrence.
Thanks, Phoenix, and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I'll start by just giving a bit of context on why we're meeting and why we're talking about fire ecology and impacts to Covenanters this evening. So, as we all know, in January we had some pretty devastating fires in quite a lot of ways. In sort of that one week, we had 400,000 hectares of Victoria burn, which is just phenomenal when you think about it. And when you put up a map of where the fires occurred, it was everywhere. We had them in the Mallee, we had them out in the Wimmera, we had them in the northeast in the forest country, and we had them all in central Victoria. Overall, we had 38 conservation covenants burnt by those fires, so that's over 2,000 hectares of private conservation estate that's protected through covenants. But we had much more conservation land, that's protected through land for wildlife programs burnt. In the Longwood fire itself, which was unique in that it was 100,000, 130,000 hectares in central Victoria, we had, over, I think 24 conservation covenants burnt there, but over 100 land for wildlife properties. And those land for wildlife properties in the Longwood area were sort of 6,000 hectares of land overall. So pretty substantial impacts on land that's cared for by people uh, for many decades in some instances. what's really special about covenants is that they provide critical refuge for species in the long term. They're these important pockets of country that people invest a lot of management effort in, and in many cases, there's rare and threatened plants and other species that support why that place is covenanted in the first place. But what we're seeing after visiting areas like Longwood and doing covenant visits is that some of these areas are recovering more effectively because of the resilience that those landscapes have because of the way they're managed by the people that look after them. And that's something in this whole debate, or I guess when we think about fire impacts and recovery, to keep in mind that a lot of that recovery comes through, as an ecologist, we view fires through the concept of the fire regime, the size, severity, seasonality, scale, interval of fires. And in some cases, our systems are adapted to um, to those parameters, right? But so in many cases, like in the Longwood fire, some of those landscapes hadn't seen fire in many years, and because of the way they were managed with low weed pressures and other sorts of good land management actions, they were able to recover in a way that they may not have done if that management hadn't been in place or if they'd have had frequent fire beforehand. But saying that, what's happening in many of our systems is those boundaries of the fire regime that species are adapted to are being pushed, and they're being pushed by land management practices, they're being pushed by landscape change and by climate change and other things. Um, so one way of viewing that from an ecological perspective is to think about the species that were impacted by these recent fires. So across that 400,000 hectares burnt in January, there's a couple of examples. So the Burralong tree frog, which is up in the northeast in the Walwa fire, that had 100% of its known records burnt in January. But it also had 40% of its range burnt in Black Summer. So what we're seeing is this frequent occurrence of these mega fires repeatedly impacting these populations. And you think one fire, a species might be able to recover and breed and increase its population, but then being impacted again and again, that's where we're starting to see these challenges. And it's a similar case with the eastern bristlebird down near Malakuta that was burnt in both sorts of events. But what we know is that covenants in these private land areas can be critical for species because people are involved in them and they're working hard to address these sorts of risks. And there's also a growing body of evidence about alternative fire management practices or land management practices that can increase the resilience of our landscapes and the ability of them to adapt and persist through what's predicted to be, worse fire activity under climate change. So I sort of wanted to put that broad context out there, but then sort of move on to framing the forthcoming discussions we're going to hear from Trust for Nature landholders that really this big challenge we're being faced from more fire activity and more impacts on species and the scale of it, it can be hard to get our head around. But the challenges, they require collective solutions and they require people from different walks of life with different perspectives and different experience to talk to each other and to learn from each other. We certainly don't need a future just driven by ecologists. We need a lot of people at the table. And that collective solution requires people to listen and to learn from each other and to respect the different points of view and lived experience of a range of people. And I really think the solution is out there for that long-term conservation if we can do that. So very keen to excited about hearing from the others tonight and to responding to questions later on. So I'll leave it there, Phoenix, and hand back to you and look forward to hearing from the panelists. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lawrence. Yeah, it's great to hear about the big picture and how important this work is. And I think Trust for Nature and Land for Wildlife landholders are constantly thinking about how to collaborate for a big picture outcome. But yeah, thinking about how we do that in response to fire becoming more present in our lives is particularly pertinent right now. So thank you so much. If anyone has any questions about fire ecology for Lawrence, please pop your questions in using the Q&A function, and we'll get to these shortly. But now I'd really love to introduce our first landholder, Janet Hagan. Janet's covenant in Ruffy was impacted by the Longwood fire just in January this year. So please join me in welcoming Janet, and thanks for being with us. Janet, do you want to start by sharing your family's experience of the fire in January?
Yes, thank you, Phoenix. We have lived in Ruffy, which was affected by the Longwood fires. It's a small community in the Strathbogie Ranges. We have lots of remnant vegetation on our property, but we farm cattle and sheep on about 300 hectares. 25% of our property is native vegetation, and we have covenants on wetlands and bogs and soaks and creek lines. So I have been the local land care facilitator for that area for 35 years. So I'm pretty embedded in the community. On the day of the fires, we lost our house and our farm and a lifetime's worth of revegetation projects were badly burnt. So many large old trees were lost. They just burnt up to nothing, and all the woody debris on the ground just sort of vanished. So that was the impact on us. There we are standing at our front gate looking down our driveway. The speed that the fire travelled and the size of the fire really took everyone by surprise. Half the houses in Ruffy were burnt, so the losses in the community are great. The land care network that I work for, the Hughes Creek Catchment Collaborative, is 85,000 hectares in size. Every property within our catchment was burnt, and both land care facilitators lost our houses, and our land care office burnt down at Ruffy in the old school, and all our equipment burnt. So we were left with very little capacity to respond to the fire. Fortunately, just before the fire, we'd had funding from Landcare Victoria to participate in the Landcare New Futures program. And we'd developed a landscape plan for the Strathbogie Ranges. And on the day of the fire, actually on the day of the fire, we were negotiating funding for the delivery of this landscape plan with the William Buckland Foundation. And pages started going off in everyone's houses, and gradually various members of the group dropped away and were not on the Zoom meeting with the William Buckland people, and they told us we'd been successful in getting this grant. But then by the next day, everything had totally changed. The whole area had been burnt. So we were lucky that adjoining environmental groups joined together to try and support the community to recover. So we had groups that we'd worked with on our landscape plan, like the Euroa Arboretum, the Strathbogie Ranges Conservation Management Network, Longwood Plains, joined together, and we really quickly formed this group called the Biodiversity Recovery Alliance. And we had to sort of ride the wave of the fire, bushfire recovery in those first few weeks to start fundraising and get ourselves sorted. So that was really a big thing that we kicked off. The main thing that people were suffering from seemed to be like eco grief and climate anxiety, and a lot of our community started to develop this fear of trees. The bush was dangerous. The bush could kill you. The bush would burn you. And we had massive post-fire cleaning up. And that was more hurtful for a lot of us than the actual harm that the flames of the fire did. Um, so the BRA group pushed ahead. We did local fundraising, got a few programs happening, sought outside help. We haven't received any state government funding for the environment so far because all of the land burnt was virtually private land. So that doesn't bring DECA into the equation. It's a community-led recovery in a big way, but you know, how can communities keep on doing this over and over again? It's a big effort. But that's nature is recovering. Just give it a chance; it'll do it itself. But yeah, the urge to control nature and manage it split the community back into old groups that we thought were long gone. The greenies and the rednecks and confrontations about that. But how we negotiate through that, I'll be interested to hear from the other landholders. Thank you.
Need to do your audio, Phoenix.
Yep, gotcha.
Apologies, everyone. It happens all the time. A bit awkward. Yeah, thanks so much, Janet. The communities have really been through so much, and just knowing that you went straight into bringing the community together, you know, when we've spoken previously, that's a huge strategy for you in getting through this, and just noticing those trends and the fear that is inspired in some people with what comes next for the environment. It's a little bit daunting, but yeah, amazing to hear about communities coming together to work through it. So if anyone would like to ask Janet any questions, we'll have that Q&A later on in the webinar. But I'd now like to introduce our second landholder, Stuart. So Stuart's conservation covenant is on the edge of Little Desert National Park and was impacted by the fire in January 2025, which also burned over 2/3 of Little Desert National Park, which is pretty epic. Welcome, Stuart, to tell us what is changing on your property as we approach 18 months since that fire. Thanks, Stuart.
All right, thank you. I'll just give you a quick rundown. We don't live on our Trust for Nature property. It's called Banksia Springs. It was a 650 hectare sheep farm and was fully re-vegged in year 2000. These photos here show before the fire. This is the re-veg and coppicing from 26 years ago. So this is prior to the fire. It was direct seeded. This is those trees are original, you can see in that photo, but the wattles in the front were all direct seeded. It's been a seed bank for years for a few people we know. They run business at re-veg, so it was a seed bank before the fire. With 21 species of orchids, because it was a sheep farm and the soil wasn't cultivated, the re-veg was just phenomenal. It still had the same soil structure. Prior to the fire, we had 40 nest boxes containing pygmy possums, owls. That's a western pygmy possum in the photo. Cute little critters. They get into the caravans, into the drawers. They were everywhere for the fires. We've done a lot of surveys out there prior to the fire. We've got the silky desert mouse, Rosenberg's monitors, and you can see all the orchids. And it's called Banksia Springs because Banksia in that photo, there's literally tens of thousands were in the seed mix when it was re-vegged, and when they're in flower, which they're in flower now in the little area that didn't burn. It's just a mass of honey eaters and pygmy possums. Really fantastic. We have a camp there, which we do a lot of monitoring of malleefowl and other species with 4 caravans, but the camp was completely destroyed. We've got 2 active malleefowl mounds, which are not going to be active for quite a while now because, as you can see by the fire, it was a really hot fire. It was started by lightning next door. That's our original yellow gum forest, which really heavily impacted. Lots of hollows in there that burnt out and the trees burnt. We were granted access 2 weeks after the fire and everything was destroyed. You see, that's all that was left, the 4 caravans, all the aluminium melted. The gas balls exploded. They didn't even vent. That's how hot the fire was. Basically, there's some more wreckage. Basically, when we first saw it, I felt like turning around and walking away because we live in the Grampians and this was the 3rd time in 2 years we've been impacted by fire. But thanks to some organisations, and I'll name them one by one, I don't know how we'd be where we are now without them. First was Blaze Aid. I didn't ask for help from Blaze Aid because I thought they only did fences. But my daughter went into the camp and they said, we'll do anything. Just we'll send 2 teams, send an assessor out. And basically they came with 2 vehicles and trailers and said, give us some work. Tell us what you want to do. And they made 5 visits, removing all the burnt steel. Without them, I wouldn't have even known where to start, to be honest. They were just fantastic. This is now, these photos are showing 16 months later after the fire. We've had land care groups. I was on a CFA training exercise and one of the girls I met from another group said, I'm in land care, how many nest boxes would you like? So she got me a whole bunch of nest boxes. And then when she started telling her friends, we had other land care groups donated as nest boxes. So this is the regrowth from the fire. These are all mallee. We've got a mix of mallee and yellow gums. So some of the plants grow from seed, some grow from the roots like these. You can see everything's flowering already, which is phenomenal in a drought. And the next one I wanted to thank was Project Platypus. They found out about where we were at, and this nest box is one of the nest boxes they put up. They said, while you're working on renewing the camp, we'll put all the nest boxes up for you. They have put bird monitoring stations in, pods from Trust for Nature. They've just been phenomenal. And basically here we are 16 months later. We were camped there the other day and I said to Kerry, look where we're at all these months later. I never would have believed that we'd be seeing flowers, regrowth like this in a drought. We're seeing the birds back already. And this is 16 months down the track, which is just mind-blowing. My only regret is I wish I was younger to see the regrowth for longer, but such is life. Yeah. So, yeah, that gives you a bit of an insight as to what we've been through and where we're at now, which I can't believe where we're at now. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Stuart. There's some hope in that for everyone. Just seeing those photos immediately after the fire and just considering, how long it took for things to start germinating with the absence of fire on your property. It felt a little bit depressing for quite some time, but really it's almost like a tourism little desert photo pack there. If anyone in this room doesn't want to go to Little Desert and check it out after that, I don't know. Pack your bags and get out there. It's absolutely stunning. I'd like to now introduce our last landholder, who can give us a bit more of a longer perspective on fire. So John has one of the oldest conservation covenants in Gippsland, north of Bairnsdale, and this covenant was impacted by the Black Summer bushfires in 2019 and 20. So I'd like to welcome John to tell us how things have changed on your property over the past half decade since the fire. Welcome, John.
Yeah, thanks, Phoenix. Yeah, half a decade, a bit more, 6 years now. And the bush is looking wonderful at the moment. Our story here is a little bit different to Janet and Stuart and Janet's in some way, but I think the fire was just as hot as what they had there. So we had 40 hectares here that were burnt. That's the size of our property, and was all forested. And lucky for us, we didn't have any infrastructure loss. So that was something that I put a lot of effort into. I could talk about that for hours because I put so much effort into it. I mean, I've got 250,000 litres in one concrete water tank on top of a hill which runs 150 sprinklers and a lot of other things which I won't go into. But basically, we were here to stay. So much so that our plan was to stay, and there was no options there because the house is our bunker. And there was no way the house is going to burn. It is an earth-covered house, and it's got shields over all the windows. Houses don't need to be earth-covered to survive fires, but that was just something I planned 40 years prior. I knew it was going to burn. I have a degree in forest ecology, so I understand what happens in the process of owning a property and what may happen in the future. You can see that shot on the far left there. That's a gully which I targeted as my project after the fire to revegetate. And my hobby as a botanist is in East Gippsland warm temperate rainforest, and that gully is south facing, and it had some rainforest species in it, but they were just minor, but they were residual from a long time ago. And I made that my project, which gave me great mental health recovery and a great environmental plus for rainforests in this region, which really suffered badly in the fires because rainforests aren't meant to burn, and so many of them were impacted up the east coast of Australia. So it gave me an opportunity to put something back that wasn't even there before. So I was lucky enough to receive a grant from our local Landcare for $10,000, which allowed me to put a 800-metre fence around that gully. And having done that, I commenced planting what ended up being 4,500 trees and shrubs inside that fence line. So you can see a lot of revegetation there that came up after the fire. But I was targeting warm temperate rainforest plants, lily pillies and muttonwoods and all sorts of plants that I'd love to look at when I go bushwalking into warm temperate rainforests. And so it became a really great project for me to try and achieve a good outcome in terms of some qualities, that exist not far from here in the form of a rainforest 5 k's from here, Fairy Dell Rainforest, just out of Sarsfield. So in a similar form, I did a lot of revegetation. So the fire and some of the pictures here, you might see there's solanum and there's Calameria and Muhlenbeckia. There were plants that came back after that fire or grew after the fire that hadn't been seen on this property in the 40 years of us living here. So there are fire-induced germination of plants which needed fire to germinate. So that was rather interesting to see. But yeah, the fire was because it came at night and there was no wind. There you can see the Calameria in the gully. It was not a crown fire, and yet there's a picture there somewhere of the river, the Nicholson River, where the canucas all burnt, the leaves all burnt, which was just an appalling situation to have happened. But so it was an indication of just how hot things got, but really, there's the photos there of some very thick revegetation, and where you saw that picture of me in amongst the dotted laurel, it just shows that the vegetation was so thick that the parasitic vine dotted laurel was just rampant across the lower mid canopy of vegetation. The picture on the far right there is the Calameria. That's all Calameria you see there. It's all gone now. It's all gone. It's a biennial plant which comes back after fire. It's all just the next succession of plants that's come after that. So being able to watch that succession of plants that come immediately after fire through to 6 years later has been great to see happen. That there's 6 months after the fire there looking across the property. So yeah, I was quite interested to see how it all happened. I didn't feel too depressed after the first 6 months. I just got it stuck into making that task my goal. Yeah. there's some black wattle there. That's how thick it can come back. So, and there's the dotted laurel over the lower vegetation, and it provided food for small animals because it drops a lot of fruit. So, there's lots of things that happen that you don't expect. That's it for me, Phoenix.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, really great to get your insights and also that longer term perspective, and also in contrast to the desert landscape and thinking about that eastern landscape and the rainforest gullies, also different to Janet's property with that granitic landscape there as well. So yeah, so thank you so much. We're now going to have a discussion, and we were really hoping people would be lobbing lots of questions into the Q&A, and I don't think there's anything in there yet, so please put your thinking caps on, start asking questions in the Q&A, but I can probably kick something off. If you've got questions for Lawrence as well, Lawrence is still with us, so he can answer some questions about fire and conservation more generally. But I might actually, John, seeing as I've got you, you mentioned there that you're an ecologist. You've been doing some trial kind of revegetation and things. Just thinking about how do you go about monitoring the changes on your property? Because really, this disturbance event is the fire is as we've seen through the photos, quite dramatic. The changes are quite visually impactful. How do you go about monitoring the changes after fire and maybe more generally on your property?
Yeah, mostly through photography, Phoenix, but there's a problem with that because when the vegetation comes back as thick as what it is, you can take a picture of a landscape in the first photo, but it doesn't take long before you can only see 3 meters, well, that's what happened after a few years. So, but I mean, you still take the photos, of course, but but it's just been a great traveling experience going through it and witnessing it as it changes. But of course, obviously the photos are the one thing, but they don't, in my mind, you can't really do much with the photography. You can show people what's happened, but I like to tell people the story, really, just, what to expect, although it's pretty hard to know what to expect, but give people an idea that there's things that are going to happen that which you just wouldn't have expected, really. I mean, one thing I didn't expect to happen is the fact that it rained a lot since that fire event here in East Gippsland. We haven't had a bad year since, really. It's been ridiculous. Yet the lead up to that fire was the opposite. So really, it's luck of the draw, I'm sure. I mean, the people out in the west and the north of me are suffering a lot more from dryness and lack of rain than what we are here. So I'm living it up, really. And I'm happy to have it that way. I'm sorry for those that have to put up with little rain.
Oh, John, no, look, it's a part of it, isn't it? Like Lawrence said earlier, it's a changing landscape. And I mean, something I've learned through working in the Southwest, and Stuart and I were talking about this the other day, how you might think about ecology and seasons and things moving through seasonal cycles, but really, for example, out in the Wimmera, really, there's no seasons, there's rain and response to rain, and that's kind of more pertinent, particularly after fire, and seeing, the plants germinating in that landscape. Yeah, Stuart, I mean, is it okay to ask you a question?
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
Yeah,
Go
thank
ahead.
you. I know that when I went out to visit you, you kind of said, it was pretty hard for you seeing the property like that, and not
Oh, it
that
was,
I
yeah.
want. Yeah, and I mean, we don't need to delve into that. I'm kind of more interested in just, you've talked a lot about, all the species that were there before. I guess in terms of like, you've now seen a lot of things germinating and coming back. Do you want to tell us a bit about, how your emotions have maybe shifted in seeing that?
Well, we're at the point now, 16 months later, we're actually getting excited every time we go because there's literally tens of thousands of seedlings coming up and there's new ones still coming up, and we're in a drought in the west. So we, instead of going there and working like we were for the last 14 months, we're actually going back and enjoying the place and finding birds, finding new plants. It's really quite exciting. And I never expected to be doing that at this point in time. But we got a good kickstart from all those groups that I told you about. We actually had Project Platypus there a few weeks ago. We were doing a hollow survey, and there was a emu stuck in the fence. There were 8 wedge-tailed eagles feeding on the carcass, and we all got excited and forgot about looking for the hollows, which was, yeah, that's incredible. Not good for the poor emu that got stuck in the fence, but yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Stuart. I mean, yeah, it's amazing to see that recovery, and it really, seeing those photos gives such hope in that landscape. I'm sorry, I've just been made aware that I think the questions are maybe coming into the chat, and I'm sorry, I apologize. I haven't been looking at the chat. So I might just actually open up the chat. Sorry, give me 2 shakes. And I'm going to have a look at some of those questions. Okay, so Alex has asked, just thanked everyone for the presentations and sharing the story with us. Alex has asked and interested to understand more about species that perhaps haven't come back, and were there any neighbouring or isolated pockets of vegetation that have survived, which have been important in the recovery. And maybe around the isolated pockets, it might be maybe good to throw to Janet, just thinking about whether or not there's pockets there. I know, Janet, you're working with a lot of recovery groups and community initiatives. Maybe you're out seeking that genetic material in the landscape.
Yes, we are, Phoenix. When we had a look at Nearmap after the fire, we thought, oh gosh, everything's black. And then we thought, oh no, there must be some green somewhere. And we found patches of green along swamps and waterways and things like that. And we're thinking, well, that's where we'll start putting up our nesting boxes and working out from those refuge areas that wildlife could have found. And at first we thought, oh, no, everything's gone, but it hasn't gone. It hid somewhere. I don't even know where it hid. People said, well, the small birds would have died of suffocation or they would have died of hunger. But we've started some citizen science bird watching events, and we've been finding the small birds are still there. So I don't know where they went, but they're there. And so those refuge areas in the landscape are just so important for everything else. It'll be interesting to see. One of our big challenges with regrowth is the deer population. So we're getting lots of species germinating that we haven't had before, like lots of peas and things like that. But how do we control the deer first to stop them browsing off all these wonderful new shrubs that are coming up? We're trying to ramp up a deer hunting program, but we're still in the early stages. We've got lists of landholders that want to control deer and lists of people that are willing to hunt on people's properties. We still haven't meshed the two together effectively, but we're working on it. Yeah.
Fantastic, Janet. Yeah, John, I know you've got some insights here too.
I could just mention you mentioned things that haven't turned up. There aren't any plants that didn't come back from seed, but what has disappeared principally, most of all, is the very old trees that had hollows.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that we really have to wait a long time for. I mean, we end up putting up 100 nesting boxes across the property, but it's nothing compared to what the rest of the forest is missing out on. I mean, we can do it on our own properties, but there's a lot of forest on the other side of the river from where I live, which goes on for hundreds of kilometres, and it's suffering from the loss of nesting hollows. There's so many species need the arboreal animals to sleep in at night and the birds to nest in the springtime. There's so many birds that just need that hollow to nest in. So that's a limited resource. That's what's missing most of all, I think, really now. and that takes so long to replace. So yeah, unfortunately, we have to wait for that to heal.
Can I just say something, Phoenix? On the subject of animals, this is interesting behaviour that we've been members of the Bushfire Recovery group for years. We have a grid of mounds around our place on other properties. All of the mounds got burnt in the fire, except one. We have a patch of bush that didn't burn with a mound in it. And two of my neighbours rang me just after the fire front and said, I've got all these malleefowl in my crops. They've all run out of the park away from the fire, which no one realised that's what they do. The problem is they've got nothing to come back to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just thought that was an interesting thing, how they deal with the fire. Yeah.
That's a little bit similar to perhaps, Stuart, to lyrebirds, because they're not
Okay.
they're similar size, but the lyrebirds mostly survived the fire here as one of the few that did, and it was suggested that they went down wombat burrows because there's no other way they could have survived.
Well, our local farmers are feeding grain to the malleefowl to keep them going. How good's that?
Yes.
I mean, you're talking farming community coming together. Just, yeah.
The lyrebirds had to make their own way.
Yeah.
It's hard to feed them, but they did survive, so it was quite incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a good segue to ask another question. John, the species that you saw after the fire that you'd not seen for 40 years, what does that say about our current understanding of those veg communities and benchmarks?
What does it say about them? I think it's generally not really well known that we have quite a few species that require fire to even be seen. And I knew that, but I didn't expect to see the ones I saw. Swathes of kangaroo apple and wrinkle nut and calamari, incense plant, just so thick, and that's what I liked recording, taking pictures of those things which they just weren't there before, and now they're gone now. But you never find it. Those three species, you wouldn't have seen them now. They're gone, but their genetics are in the soil. Calamaria has a seed smaller than a grain of sand. How does it manage to not be killed off in a fire? I think the answer is that the ants take them underground and put them in their larders, and they're protected from the real intense heat, just as lost seed, amongst their holes in the ground, and that's where it's got to come from. Really, I mean, the kangaroo apple, perhaps much hardier seed, and lots of plants who do have that really hard seed shell, like the black wattle that just came up so thick. But calamaria, you couldn't even feel the seed if you put it between your fingers, and yet it came up so thick. Another similar thing I did in my rainforest, I threw out the seed of tangleweed and native passion fruit, which come back after fire. And I've thrown the seed in there so that when the next fire comes, it will cover that gully and protect it from regenerating eucalypts, which is what actually stops a lot of warm temperate rainforests from progressing. It gets drowned out by the regrowth of eucalypts. So you can put species in there to assist in that process, something I've already done. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, John, because on the other side of that, there's a few questions in the chat asking about overabundance of species. And I don't know. Yeah, Janet, did you want to answer?
I'm just thinking, how do you manage all those pioneer species, millions of silver wattles and things? Do you interfere or do you let nature take its course?
Wow, look at John shaking his head solidly. And I know.
What do you reckon, John?
It's just called succession. It's just succession. It's what's meant to be. There's no point trying to fight it. It'll sort itself out. It's not as though any of those plants are really that problematic, as seen with the dotted laurel that grew over the wattles that was so thick, feeding off the wattles, which were in ridiculous quantities, and it just subdued their growth and produced its own fruit and fed animals by doing that. I mean, and yet it won't be that long before the wattles will thin out, and the next succession of plants will come. You know, it's what has happened through millennium and has evolved. So you just have to observe it and happily see what nature does, and hopefully we don't end up with too much dryness and death due to not enough water. This is the biggest problem, I think, because animals need that. And it's plant diversity and plant density that gives the ability for animals to survive. And in the end, it's really about water. Water creates life in the form of plant growth, and that's what insects and animals feed on. We need insects for the birds to eat. We're not going to see a lot of birds unless we've got the insects, and to have them there, we need water to create vegetation. And without the water, we live in hope that we get enough water to get an ecosystem back up and running.
Can I just say, after our re-veg project, there were too many species from the direct seeding, and over the years we watched them senesce and thin themselves out. Some Banksias grew in clay pans where they're not supposed to grow, and they died out of the clay pans and then only were on the hills. Yeah, so nature sorts itself out.
Yeah, I mean, you did see me shaking my head there, Phoenix, about changing things. I planted a rainforest, so I was changing things myself. I'm playing God in my gully, on my rainforest gully, because I pulled black wattles out of that gully before I planted my rainforest, because there was no way the competition was going to go on the side of my rainforest plant. So I did pull out thousands of black wattles, but had I have not done that, I was no way I was going to be able to create a new ecosystem. So I have to point out that you can do some small work of your own to do different ecosystems, but and that's what I had done there. Yeah.
Lawrence, have you got ideas around this discussion to share with people?
On whether you should interfere, Phoenix, in terms of the successional trajectory. No, I think John is spot on. I mean, most of the examples we've talked about here are fires within that sort of tolerable regime that we talk about when we read Shield and we talk about successional dynamics or what systems can cope with. There's a concept that's out there, and you can look it up on Google if you're so inclined, like around landscape traps. So that's the Lindemeyer concept, that if you have this repeat disturbance, say mountain ash seeding is the example that he comes up with, and then you have a process that then takes out that next cohort and the cohort after it before the seed bank can replenish, you end up in a state that you can't get out of, this landscape trap. And he's talking about silver wattles in the examples that he discusses. In those cases, then you need to intervene, right? And I think it's that idea of altered fire regimes and the context in which they occur, and then what we need to do. I think it's always also an interesting question when we get asked a lot, like, what should we do? A lot of ecology and conservation is values judgments that people make about landscapes and their directions. So I think, as landholders, you've got this unique opportunity. Like, it's fascinating to hear, John, like the restoration you tried, and then how it gets overwhelmed, or how you see the landscape recover and you just learn. And I think that's probably what I'd encourage Phoenix people, just to try things, try thinning out some of your regrowth. I mean, that's an interesting question in the chat about thinning, because when it's done at scale, it can, whilst you can maybe encourage a tree to grow thicker and it's more resilient to another fire, which we've got to be creative with these repeated altered fires that are happening, it also puts a lot of debris on the ground that increases the fuel and the intensity of future fire. So there's this kind of feedbacks we've got to think about. But I know if we don't try things, we're probably not going to be able to adapt to that uncertain future that we're seeing unfold.
Yeah, and I mean, also it might depend on the condition of your property, like Lawrence is saying, before the fire, what's in the seed bank already and what can migrate in with the help of ants and other species, and kind of having a deep analysis on that, which a lot of Land for Wildlife and Trust for Nature covenanters have a good sense of their properties. But yeah, sometimes waiting is the best option. And having said that, someone asked earlier in the chat, will Trust for Nature staff provide site-specific advice in the aftermath of the fires? I know that the teams are getting well and truly getting out there, visiting landholders that have been impacted by the fires over the last couple of years. Yeah, in the southwest and across for these fires this year as well, that Janet's family has been impacted by too. So someone has asked, Janet, have you seen any koalas return yet?
There's a few. They were the first animals that people were reporting. A lot of them were taken away by wildlife carers very early in the fire,
yeah,
and looked after and released back into some of the unburnt areas of the bogies. Unfortunately, our resident koalas didn't survive the fire. We had a reasonably healthy koala population before the fire. So if anyone sees one, they post it on iNaturalist just to share with everyone. It might be the same koala being photographed everywhere he goes, but there are a few left.
You reckon he's just photobombing everyone's
Yeah.
photos? Do you think there's enough food out there for them, Janet? It's happening?
Well, they'd have to be eating they would have had to wait for the epicormic growth to happen on the eucalypts. So they would have been getting hungry. I don't really know about that one. Yeah, I know quite a few were taken by wildlife carers to be.
Yeah, an amazing effort. I know that in community coordination also, some key people were able to relocate some malleefowl eggs in the fires in Garryword, which meant that they were able to be incubated in controlled environment, so that I don't think all of them survived, unfortunately, but that rapid action from local community members who knew where those animals were to be able to support them to survive, pretty special. Yeah, someone's actually asked a question about kangaroo and deer grazing on the properties, and maybe that's a good one to throw to you, Lawrence, around, I mean, deer, we've all, I think when I spoke to each of you, you've all mentioned deer. How do we
Even in Little Desert.
deer? We know there's a national deer action plan, and how that's translating through the landscape is interesting to think about. There's Trust for Nature covenanters and also Land for Wildlife people. It's definitely very topical, but I guess, Lawrence, what are your thoughts around some of these local impacts and deer populations and how communities might mobilise around that?
Yeah, I think deer is an ongoing problem, Phoenix. I mean, there's not a lot of silver bullets for these kind of things. Like with any pest management, that integrated landscape scale kind of approach is needed, and it needs people to get together and talk. I think it's challenging, like Janet pointed out earlier, that often the funding you need for fencing and this sort of thing and that coordinated management through DECA, it's not always there especially in these types of fires where you've got predominantly private land and the government trigger is around the public land spend. So yeah, there's some issues there, Phoenix. I think when I did a bit of recovery work around the Mount Cole fire in Western Victoria with DECA a couple of years ago, and we targeted deer control there to the one sort of remnant. We had the aerial control crew for the state come down and say, well, where should we go to shoot deer? And it's like, well, they're not going to be in Mount Cole because the place just went up and they're all burnt. You could walk around and see them on the ground. But if you go over there, that's the last intact remnant. They're all going to be coming out of there into the rest of the forest. And sure enough, they went in there and cleaned up a bunch. So I think, those refuges are important for biodiversity, but they're also important for, sources of pests and things. So yeah, that integrated approach, I think people coming together.
Can I just say something? I saw a question pop up about Indigenous burning. My wife worked in Alice Springs for 12 months, and we spoke to a few of the elders, And they said the big problem with Indigenous burning, there's so many weedy species and weedy grasses now, it burns differently. And they said we've got to try and get some science behind it as well. Work with the Indigenous people, but it's not as easy now with all these weedy species that have been introduced. Yeah, just thought I'd mention that.
It's a good point, Stuart, because a lot of the Trust for Nature regional teams are working with First Peoples in reintroducing cultural fire practices back out on country, whether it's through, covenants or Trust for Nature reserves. We're actively working with First Peoples to help, support them realise their healthy country plans and also learn from the altered landscape. And so, yeah, I must apologise tonight. We weren't aiming to fully dive deep into Indigenous burning practices. Wasn't really in the remit of tonight, but noting that it is something we'd like to pick up on later, more specifically. But yeah, honestly, I think like you've touched on there, Stuart, there's a lot we've all got to learn. And, First Peoples are also often very small community groups running these burns. So, capacity is limited, but honestly, we are out there doing that work. And someone's mentioned there in the chat, are we considering using cool patchy burns in the landscape? Maybe like Lawrence said, this fuel load and, the distance between the fire that's been in a lot of the landscape has been too great. We've got a fuel load that's very high, and how to kind of reduce that fuel load and then get First Peoples back out in there caring for country. It's an interesting kind of thought around succession of works in relationship to the successional recovery, ecologically speaking. So, definitely growing in that space and learning.
I had a patch of silky tea tree, which the silky desert mice use, and it was senescing, and a few people said it needs to burn. Well, it's had a big burn now. And I got the CFA out to look at our property, and I decided not to do it because I would have had to put fire breaks through with dozers and introduce weeds. So I never did it. Now the fire's done it for me. But yeah, that was interesting how you handle putting fire breaks in to do a burn.
Yeah, well, I guess it's also, like you're saying, Stuart, the type of burn. And I mean, I've had the privilege of being at cultural fire being Winmark being reintroduced onto Wadawurrung country, and I mean, literally there was children walking around. You could walk through the fire. It was so gentle, and so I mean that's not fire as we kind of know it in our psyche in some ways. So also changing the understanding and the fear of fire and the way it can be utilised as a very effective tool. Janet, like you said earlier, you've got, the Fabaceae species coming back into your property that you haven't seen before. That's, that diversity is so important.
Well, it had been 125 years since the Strathbogie Ranges were last burned, but the ferocity of that fire, some cool burning or some ecological burning would have had very little impact unless it was done on a huge scale, because the fire was, it moved so quickly and was so hot. There was nothing that was going to stop it other than a change in the wind.
Yeah, it's almost like we need a lot of resources and a big reset. And then after that, we can kind of get back to a maintenance regime, but that's going to require a lot of commitment and working together, like Lawrence said. How can we work together and have the conversations that need to be had to coordinate this on a landscape scale? So definitely our Trust for Nature covenanters are a valuable part of the way we can communicate with each other. So thank you all. I am very aware we are almost at time. It's with 1 minute to go. I would very much like to thank our panelists. the team, the communications team supporting, has reassured me that we'll be able to look at any unanswered questions and send through some answers in a follow-up email. This has also been recorded, so we will be able to share it with you soon, and you can, share it with others who might be interested in watching it. Also, if you have any questions about fire and your property, please reach out to your local Trust for Nature team member. So it might be one of your conservation program managers or your local area manager. I'd like to remind everyone that we also currently have open our landholder support program for landholders impacted by the fires this year, thanks to the generosity of our supporters. This program provides up to $2,000 for covenants impacted by fire for urgent recovery activities, and will be open till the 31st of May. So I think that's this Sunday. So head to our website and we'll also add the link into the chat. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us tonight and engaging in this important topic. I particularly like to thank Janet, Stuart and John for sharing your experiences with us. It's so powerful to hear directly from people like you who have been impacted by fire. And despite the confronting impact, your stories show us that habitat can recover, and they show us how important the work we do to care for nature is. Perhaps one thing we can take away from tonight is the importance of connecting with each other to share knowledge. And so, yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you, Phoenix. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.